See if anybody else.
Oh.
All right, so do I need to make this full screen? Yeah. Or is this what it's, is this it? Okay, all right. Well, welcome everybody. Yako Key for joining. I guess I should say Holly Toe first, but this is going to be our nutrition deep discussion where I'm going to continue the sort of nutrition foundation that we started a couple months ago. This is everything that I wanted to say but couldn't say in 1 hour. This is the remainder of that. So I guess I should introduce myself to everybody. I think everybody here knows me, but my name is Joshua Pond. I've been working for the Choctaw Nation for 5 years. I've been a fitness specialist for 4 of those years, and I got into this kind of personal training, group exercise business because I noticed that we're all, well, not all of us, but the majority of us in the nation are suffering from diseases that are classified as preventable. They're diseases of lifestyle. And that's what I've really been focused on for the last 4 years. So I was really happy whenever the Masali program came along. I've been involved since the beginning of it. Masali is a Choctaw word that means to cure, to heal, and that's what we're all about here, because what we have learned, what science has learned over the last 20 years or so, is this emerging lifestyle medicine discipline that is all about the lifestyle factors that limit our potential for developing these diseases that are classified as preventable, right? So this is all about modifying our lifestyle to stack the deck in our favor to live long and healthy lives. So today we're kind of on the same path as last time. I want you to leave here knowing what to eat, what not to eat, and why. And we're going deep down into the molecular level of why today in the second half of this presentation. But I'm going to start by reviewing what we did last time. All right. So first and foremost, when we're making decisions about what to eat, we're going to follow this quote from Dr. Chris Hardy and Marty Gallagher, the authors of this book called Strong Medicine, one of my absolute favorite books, full of wonderful information. I could probably read it 2 or 3 more times and learn something new every time. I've only read it 3 times so far. So this is the guiding principle of all of our nutrition decisions. Eat food in its natural form from local sources as unprocessed as possible, with an emphasis on food quality, right? One statement, but there's a lot to unpack there. I could probably take 2 hours to unpack it. That's going to take longer than that. But anyway, the first thing that we can do, maybe the biggest thing that we could possibly do as far as our nutrition goes to limit the onset of preventable diseases, is the complete elimination of that processed business there, right? So let's just look at the right side of the screen for a second. This little tree here is illustrating where our chronic disease comes from, right? So down at the bottom are some of the areas of life: our nutrition, our activity, our sleep habits, our stress habits. We kind of split them apart so that they're manageable, so that we can focus on kind of one thing at a time. So all of these areas of life contribute to our levels of inflammation in our body and our levels of oxidative stress. So I went pretty far on what those mean in our first one, and we have that video available if you want a review on that. So basically, too much chronic inflammation and too much oxidative stress directly leads to many types of cancers, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, as well as the metabolic diseases of obesity and diabetes. So the one weird trick that we can do to limit our possibility of developing these diseases is to eliminate ultra-processed foods. And I love this quote over here on the left side from the American Medical Association. While it may be convenient, consuming ultra-processed foods on a regular basis increases a person's risk of health complications, including cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. But it can be hard to tell when these foods are on your plate, and it is hard to tell when they're on your plate. So we're going to go a little bit more into that. So one of the first ways that we can identify those ultra-processed foods first is, does it have a barcode? Does it come in a package? Does it have an ingredient list? If so, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's an ultra-processed food, but it is suspect. So we need to look at every single ingredient list that we get a hold of. And we're looking for these things on the left: certain kinds of fats, which we're going to go into, added sugars, preservatives, artificial dyes, natural artificial flavors, maybe high fructose corn syrup, artificial sweeteners, and thickeners. These are kind of classes of chemicals that get added to our food that over time kind of cause some chaos and calamity within our body. They don't make us sick immediately, but over time, their effects accumulate. So some of those particular ingredients, and this is not an exhaustive list, there have been about 800 of these additives that have entered our food system in the last 25 or so years. But here are some of the big players that you might look for. So if you would like to take a picture of this, I don't have a printout. Our printer is on the fritz at the moment, so sorry. But if you want to take a picture of it, you want to take a screenshot of this later as we get the video up, this is something to take with you, and look for these ingredients. They are kind of some red flags. If you see those on your food list, chances are, if they're in your ingredient list on the food that you're about to eat, you're dealing with an ultra-processed food. But like I said, not all food that comes in a package with a barcode and an ingredient list is this ultra-processed. So we're going to look here quickly at a tale of two cottage cheeses, right? Cottage cheese is one of my favorite ways to illustrate this here. So whenever we look at cottage cheese A, we're seeing cultured skim milk, cream, and salt. If you're not lactose intolerant, these foods are not problems for you, right? Now, whenever we look at cottage cheese B, that list is quite a bit longer. Now, more ingredients does not necessarily mean that this food is going to be bad for you. We have to check on these particular ingredients, and we have to think about the context of your life and your body and where you're at right now. All right, so we're going to look at just a few of these in detail. On this cottage cheese B, the ingredients that kind of give me pause, we'll go through these one by one, starting with the ones in red. So maltodextrin, that's a type of sort of synthetic starch that is put together, and it somehow has a higher glycemic index than glucose, the gold standard for the glycemic index. Glucose is a level of 100. That's kind of like what we measure everything against in terms of how it's going to affect your blood sugar, right? And elevated blood sugar elevates inflammation, and oxidative stress leads us toward chronic disease. So somehow maltodextrin is even higher. It's about 113 or so. It's about 113 or so on that glycemic index. So even though a food may contain maltodextrin, it can say no sugar added, but it's going to spike your blood sugar even more than added sugar. So that's one, if you're watching your blood sugar, that's one to pay attention to and eliminate from your food. It's not necessary for it to be in cottage cheese, or else cottage cheese A wouldn't be able to exist. All right. So next up, mono and diglycerides. Those are sort of like thickening agents that have been linked to stroke and cardiovascular disease by pathways of elevated inflammation and oxidative stress. Carrageenan is another thickener. These are ingredients that are added to improve the mouthfeel of the food as you eat it, but studies have shown carrageenan in higher levels of intake. So small intake, probably not a problem, but when you're getting it in lots of different foods as a staple over time, high levels of intake have been linked to about a 30% increase in instances of colorectal cancer, right? And then lastly of the red light list, potassium sorbate, that's a preservative, sometimes called an anti-digestive, which I think is funny. But what it does is improve the shelf stability of that food. It will sit on the shelf and not go rancid as quickly, but whenever we take in potassium sorbate, it is known to be genotoxic. And what that means is that when it comes into contact with DNA, it fragments that DNA. That will elevate inflammation and oxidative stress as your body comes in to clean up that problem. And if your body fails to clean up that problem, that can lead to types of cancer. All right, so those are kind of our red lights on this particular list. Then we also have kind of a yellow light with these gums. These are also thickeners, the guar gum, xanthan gum, carabine gum. There's less evidence to support that these are sort of as toxic as these other ingredients. But all three of these have been shown, let's say you already are dealing with an inflammatory bowel condition, these make that worse. And when inflammation goes up, risk for chronic disease goes up, right? So in the context of your life, if you're dealing with diabetes, we're going to want to look for maltodextrin and eliminate it. If you're dealing with chronic inflammatory bowel conditions, we're going to look for those gums and completely eliminate them until your body kind of comes back to baseline. And I'll be honest, that xanthan gum is something that I put on my eggs every morning. I really like sriracha sauce on my eggs, and it has a little bit of xanthan gum in it. But I'm not currently dealing with any inflammatory conditions, and I only get it from that hot sauce in small amounts. So I think that, and that's a decision that I'm making for myself, I'm willing to risk it because I really like the flavor of sriracha, right? So everybody's got to make their own decisions about how this goes. I just want you to be aware of these additives as they're coming into your foods. Check your ingredient labels and aim to minimize these additional additives. As we do that, you're stacking the deck in your favor of not developing those sorts of chronic diseases. Okay, so that's what not to eat. Now we're going to talk about what to eat and go really deep on why. So this is our meal template for the Masali program. Every single meal, 3 to 5 times a day, depending on your hunger level, your body size, your activity level, you're going to be eating 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal. You're going to get 2 sources of fermentable fiber per meal, and you're going to feed your activity with starch and sugar. So we're going to be eating those starch and sugar sources in conjunction with our activity. If you mowed the lawn and you lifted weights today, you need more starch and sugar. If you were more or less sedentary for the day, you need less. So we're going to start with basically protein and vegetables and add in those higher density sources of energy as we need them. And we're going to go into what exactly I mean by that much protein, what do I mean by fermentable fiber and starch and sugar, and then we'll finish with talking about fats, how they kind of come in and how they guide our decision-making process along that low process, naturally sourced food. Okay, so this is our food list. This is, if you want to take a picture of this, you're welcome to. It's kind of small up there and difficult to read. If you want to come up and take a picture, you can. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is kind of what those things, the protein, the fermentable fiber, and the starch and sugar correlate to. These are the ones that I recommend. Meats, cottage cheese, Greek yogurt, as long as it's lightly processed. Okay. Whenever we're looking for starch sources, that's our potatoes, our squash, our legumes, our quinoa, oatmeal, sprouted grain, bread. Whenever we're talking about sugars for the Masali program, that's going to be berries, fruits, and maybe some kinds of dairy if you tolerate dairy well. And when we're talking fermentable fiber sources, that's what we collectively know as vegetables. That's asparagus, broccoli, cauliflower, all of those leafy greens, the roots, the cucumbers and celery and all of that kind of stuff. Everything that we think of as vegetables, that's what I mean by fermentable fiber. So now we're going to go into the new stuff. That's the end of the review. Let me get a little sip of coffee here. Okay, so this slide here is kind of where the nutrition discussions usually start. We may have heard about these macronutrients before. These are kind of the main building blocks of our food. They are classes of chemicals that make up our food, all right? They're what our body uses to make and power your flesh machine, you know, what this thing is that we're piloting around. So the model that we're typically familiar with is food as energy, and that is true. For every gram of carbohydrate and every gram of protein that you eat, When those break down, you're going to get about 4 calories worth of energy. And calorie is just a measure of energy, right? Whenever your body breaks down fat, every gram that you break down is going to be 9 calories of energy. It's more than twice as dense of an energy source. And that's why we look after our fats, so that we don't get like way too many calories by accident. It's just really easy to overeat them. The point that I really want to drive home today with this discussion of the molecules that our food is made out of is that food is not just energy, but it is also information. When we take in food, when we take in fats, for every gram, we're going to get 9 calories of energy, no matter where that fat comes from. But the cell signaling and what gets directed and turned on and turned off, and the way that our body orchestrates itself, will be influenced vastly differently by the different particular kinds of molecules that we're bringing in within these classes. All right, so we're going to start off with carbohydrates and break down those different kind of sorts of carbohydrates here. But first, I want to point out that all of this stuff is made out of the same stuff, so to speak. Whenever we get down to the elemental level, we don't need to know about, I mean, everybody remembers this chart from school, right? We like learned it and then forgot it. We don't need to know all of the elements. But what I want to point out is that in organic chemistry, that's the chemistry of all organic life. Almost everything is made almost entirely out of hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. And the thing to know about these is they have some electrons. You see these kind of little doodads orbiting here, right? Those determine how these different elements snap together, sort of like puzzle pieces. It's all way more complicated than that, but that's close enough to reality, okay? So the key takeaways is that everything in biology is made of these 4 things, plus a few more things. And molecular structure determines physiological function, right? That's how we're going to kind of root our decision-making process as we're selecting whole foods, of like, what is this food made out of, okay? So let's go into our carbohydrates, beginning with our, we're going to talk about fiber, starch, and sugar. We're going to start by talking about sugar because all 3 of these things are carbohydrates, right? Your fiber, your starches, and your sugar are technically carbohydrate chemicals, right? So the 3 main types. Sugar is, we know where that comes from. That's table sugar, sugar-sweetened beverages like soda, and we get sugar from fruits. Starches come from roots and tubers and grains, all of your breads and pastas, any of those kinds of foods that we typically think of as carbs. We're usually thinking about those starches. And then fiber is another kind of carbohydrate that comes primarily from those vegetables, from beans and legumes, from fruits, and even from nuts, all right? So then let's go a little bit deeper on sugar to begin with. You don't have to know the chemistry of how these are put together. I just want to point something out here. We're going to talk about 3 kinds of sugar here. Glucose is the first one. So this is our body's primary fuel source. Your liver stores it up. Your muscles store it up. It's what they measure whenever we're monitoring your blood glucose levels whenever you're dealing with diabetes. We don't want those to get too high because when it's in your blood in excessive levels, it contributes to inflammation and chronic oxidative stress and ages us quickly and leads to those chronic diseases that we don't want, right? Now, if we look here, you don't have to necessarily memorize this, but those H's mean hydrogens, the O's mean oxygens, the C's mean carbons, and glucose is just a ring of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens arranged in a certain way that makes it glucose. And when our body sees that, it absorbs it immediately, takes it where it needs to go to burn for energy. Our bodies break it apart, get energy in that process, and that's how we go. It powers our brain, it powers our muscles, powers everything in our body, so to speak. Now, relative to that, we have fructose. And if you notice, that ring structure is slightly different, all right? But it's still all made of the same stuff. It's hydrogens, it's oxygens, and it's carbons, and there's nothing else in there. But the way that they're arranged, we call this different arrangement fructose. And when your body takes that in, it cannot be used immediately by our biology. It goes to our liver and either gets converted into glucose for immediate use or gets converted into a kind of fat for storage, right? So whenever we are taking in fructose, fructose is primarily in sugar, in fruit. In fruit. It's the sugar that's in fruit. So then we'll think about sucrose. That's white table sugar. That's the sugar that we're all really familiar with, right? That is one sucrose connected to one glucose. I misspoke again. One glucose connected to one fructose. All right. So these first two will connect to one another, and that's what white table sugar is. When our body takes it in, it breaks it apart, immediately tries to find a place to burn the glucose, takes the fructose to your liver, and then either converts that to glucose or fat. So the main takeaway here is that this structure, that ring structure being subtly different, changes the way that these sugars behave in your body. You're still getting 4 calories for every gram of it that you eat, but what's happening inside of you is different. All right. So then we'll go on to starch. So this is the stuff that's in bread, in pasta, in all the grains, whether it's whole grains or not. It's in our sort of roots and tubers, the things that we think of as those high starch, high energy vegetables like potatoes, sweet potatoes, maybe even squash and carrots to some degree. The interesting thing about starch is that it's just sugar that's all linked up with these links that are a little bit more difficult than the sucrose link to break down. But our bodies have the ability to break apart the starch and use that sugar that comes out of that breaking apart process immediately, right? So that is another way that our blood sugar goes up. So whenever you're dealing with diabetes or you're dealing with obesity or you're trying to get leaner or you're trying to keep your blood sugar from spiking too high so that you lower your inflammation, starch and sugar sources are your lever. Your blood sugar will not get out of hand if you don't eat too many of those. All right, that's the main takeaway. Find those sources of starch and sugar in your diet, quantify them. That's your lever. We're going to eat protein and fiber as pretty much as we want to your hunger level, but watch that starch and sugar. So fiber, the difference between starch and fiber, interestingly, fiber is also long strings of sugar. The difference is the kinds of bonds that make up those strings, our body does not have the capability to break those down. But the bacteria in our gut biome do. They have the ability to break down some of these kinds of fibers. There are a bunch of kinds of fibers, but basically these fermentable fibers is what they're called. Our gut bacteria break those down, and the byproducts of them consuming the sugars that these fibers are made out of feeds our gut, keeps it healthy, bolsters our immune system, and contributes to keeping inflammation and oxidative stress where it needs to be. All right, so that's the big case for vegetables. There is another, I'm going to take a little aside here. There is another case for eating these vegetables. The reason that we try to eat as many different colors of the rainbow as we can when you're selecting those 2 sources of fermentable fiber, when you're building your meals, is this class of, we can think about them like plant pharmaceuticals. They are called phytonutrients. There are thousands of them, and they all kind of exert benefits to our body, to our immune system, to our resilience, to our digestion, to cancer fighting. They downregulate all kinds of things going on with cancer and inhibit its ability to sort of get a foothold in our body. And the interesting thing, the cool thing to know is that the color of the food tells you what phytonutrients are in there, and we want a variety of them. So try to get as many different colors of the rainbow every day. The quantity doesn't matter as much as the variety that you get in. So 1 bite of every color that you can is a good strategy for your long-term health, right? That's the main case for vegetables. They feed your gut biome, and they have all these other compounds that do good things for us, right? That's why, coming back to that, what to eat, what not to eat, and why, that's why we're aiming to get 2 different kinds of these fermentable fiber sources in every single meal, all right? So the last thing that I want to point out here is that these whole food sources of carbohydrates come with different sort of percentages of these three different classes of carbohydrates. So whenever we think about blueberries, we call that a source of sugar. But we choose blueberries as a source of sugar because they come with a good bit of fiber, right? If you get your sugar from a sugar-sweetened beverage, it's going to be purely sugar. But whenever we bring fiber into the equation with the sugar, we get those benefits of blood sugar fueling ourselves, but that fiber in the digestion process keeps the blood sugar from spiking to a degree that's going to be detrimental to our health, all right? Whenever we look at sweet potatoes, we typically call them a source of starch, but they have also sugar and fiber. For every 100 grams of sweet potato you eat, you're going to get about 12.5 grams of starch, but you're also going to get 6 grams of sugar and almost 3 grams of fiber that's going to slow down, again, that blood sugar spike. So you're going to fuel yourself, but you're not going to spike the blood sugar to those detrimental levels. And then whenever we look at something like cabbage, these are our fermentable fiber sources. We typically call them fermentable fiber sources because they are almost entirely fiber with very low starch and a really low amount of sugar in them, right? So those are going to spike your blood sugar the least. You can practically eat as much of those as you want, and your blood sugar is not going to go up. So that's kind of the main thing that I want to point out with this slide, is that sugar is going to feed the body fast, right? Whenever you eat sugar, your blood sugar is going to go up quickly. Starch is going to feed the body a little bit slower than sugar. Fiber feeds your gut biome and maintains healthy gut function. And in nature, with whole foods, sugar and starch always comes with a little bit of fiber that's going to be beneficial. And that's why we're making that choice to choose these unprocessed foods over packaged sources of starch and sugar. Those typically have the fiber completely stripped out of them, right? So that's why we're making that choice. That's why we're aiming to eat only whole foods. It's the case for that. So now we can move on to protein. I find protein so fascinating here. So there's a lot of words that get tossed around about protein. This is the reason, I'm going to go through the reason why we aim for 20 to 30 grams of these particular animal sources of protein. And there is a way to get quality protein from plants, but we're going to talk about that. So the first thing to know is that proteins are long strings of amino acids. So this little structure up here is one amino acid. You'll notice that it's primarily oxygen and hydrogen. That little in there is nitrogen. That's a key difference about protein. It's the macronutrient that contains nitrogen. And then we got some hydrogen and carbon over there. I believe that's a sulfur, but we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so basically there are 20 different amino acids, and these amino acids are what make proteins. As we can see with our little bakery down here inside of our body, our proteins are classified as either essential or non-essential. The non-essential ones, that means that we don't have to get them in from our diet. As long as our bodies have enough hydrogen and carbon and nitrogen and oxygen laying around, our DNA has the sort of recipes to manufacture these non-essential amino acids. We can just make more of them if we need more of them. The essential ones are called essential because we do not have the instructions in our DNA to make them. So we must consume them from our food. We have to get them from outside sources, okay? So just a quick what protein really is. These 20 amino acids line up into strings and become the 100,000 plus different kinds of proteins that it takes to make us us. They become antibodies that allow our immune system to identify threats and work against those threats. They become contractile proteins so that I can stand up here and gesticulate as I talk to you. They're structural proteins that kind of make the structure of our cells. They can be storage proteins, and they can be transport proteins like the hemoglobin that's in your blood that transports oxygen around and lets you be, right? real quickly, the way that they are made is they're long strings of these amino acids. Some amino acids want to grab a hold to water. Some of them want to push water away. And when we string these amino acids up in their certain order and drop them into water, which our body is mostly, some pieces of them push the water away and some of them pull the water in, and they fold up into these incredibly complex structures. And again, structure determines function, right? So the particular string of amino acids folds up a certain way for it to do its job. And all these different structures make that job happen. Okay, so then we can talk about the necessity of protein. So we aim to eat this much protein because muscle mass is our greatest health insurance policy. The more muscle mass you have, the more likely you are to survive illness and injury as you age. At any time in your life, your muscle mass is like your health bank. And whenever you come down with an illness or you get injured, the more of it you have, the more likely you are to recover well. So we want to hang on to it. It's really precious. And we make more of it and we hang on to it by combining resistance training and adequate protein intake. And that's why in the Masali program, we really emphasize resistance training. Appropriate, regular, long-term doses of resistance training stimulate your body to build muscle mass. And then we have to make sure that your body has enough of those amino acids to make the muscle mass. So that's what this little picture is illustrating here is our muscles are always kind of breaking down. And what we want is over time for our protein synthesis to outstrip our protein breakdown. And we stimulate that protein synthesis. This is the 20 to 30 grams of protein recommendation. Like 5 grams of protein is not enough to stimulate that process of muscle protein synthesis. It's a sort of metabolically expensive mechanism for your body to go through. And so it will not start the process unless it notices that you have enough of these amino acids laying around to actually make the process beneficial. And that happens at about 20 to 30 grams of protein, depending on your body size. If you're on the smaller side, you may only need 20 grams at a time. If you're on the larger side, you may need up to 30 or maybe even more at a time. Okay, so that's why we're encouraging regular feedings throughout the day of an adequate amount, a threshold amount of protein. So then lastly, we're going to talk about protein quality. So those 9 essential amino acids that we need that our body cannot manufacture from their constituent parts laying around, those we can acquire those from animal sources like meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. Those food sources provide all 9 of those essential proteins in the necessary quantities to feed our muscle. Okay, so that's why we emphasize those. It is possible to get all 9 of those amino acids from plant sources. The thing is, even good sources of protein from plants are typically lacking in 1 or more of those 9 essential amino acids. And so what we do is combine protein sources from different kinds of plants. And that's something to look into. If you're choosing to go with a plant-based diet, you can get a plant-only diet. You can get enough protein, but it's going to require some careful combination of these protein sources. So essentially, you might say, to combine legumes that tend to be low in the amino acid methionine. Grains have enough methionine. And so they're going to be low in lysine and threonine, which legumes are high enough in. So if we combine legumes, that's beans and lentils, if we combine those with rice and the total protein content of that combination equals 20 to 30 grams of protein, we're going to call that a complete source. That's going to be enough to feed your muscles, right? The only drawback is this type of strategy almost always brings in very large amounts of starch. So if you don't have great blood sugar control, that is not going to be a good strategy until you do. That protein, those 20 grams of protein is going to come along with enough starch to spike your blood sugar out of control. Okay, that's why we, again, are emphasizing these animal sources. So our protein key points is that protein is vital to the development and retention of muscle mass. which is vital to our health. Animal sources of protein are complete, meaning a single source, one cut of animal protein with no need to combine anything with anything else is going to provide enough amino acids to adequately feed your muscle. And plant sources are going to require a complementary combination of feeding to achieve this muscle building effect, right? Okay, so one more subject. We've got fats to go over. So this is one of my favorite subjects because this really drives home that idea that structure determines function. So if you see up here, fat functions in a lot of different ways. They carry a lot of functions. They serve as energy storage in our body. They're a major component of cell membranes. They're a major component of our nervous system, the development of our brains and our nerve function. And they deal a lot with cell signaling and communication between our cells to signal our immune system to do what it needs to do. Okay, so again, structure equals function. Our fats are all long chains of carbons linked to one another, and they have some double bonds in some kinds of fats, and I'm going to show you what that means here in a second. But if you look here, they always have an alpha end. That's this end over here with two oxygens and a hydrogen, and then they have an omega end. That's the end that caps with a hydrogen. So whenever we're looking at this, these long strings of carbons bond 4 times. They can bond side to side and up and down, so to speak, for illustration purposes. All right. So whenever we think about saturated fat, you may have heard of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. Saturated fat typically comes from animals and from tropical fruits like coconut oil, palm oil, right? Those are where we get our saturated fats from. Excuse me. Monounsaturated fat come from some of these other kinds of fruit fats. It's also present in lots of other foods in smaller quantities, but some of the best sources of monounsaturated fat is avocado oil and olive oil, and polyunsaturated fat comes from vegetables, vegetable oils, seeds, and seed oils. We get them from those refined oils like canola, soybean, safflower, sunflower, all of those kinds of oils are polyunsaturated. So these are classified by the saturation is referring to the amount of hydrogens on these atoms, hydrogen atoms on these molecules. All right. So in a saturated fat, it's all single bonds between the carbons. And so those carbons are all connected to 2 hydrogens. So we say that the molecule is saturated with hydrogens. There are as many hydrogens on that molecule as there can possibly be. In the unsaturated fats, let's say mono means one, single. In a monounsaturated fat, you'll see that it forms a little kink there. And that kink happens because you notice these 2 are missing that hydrogen that would be here if it was a saturated fat. And those 2 bonds are now against one another. So the carbons are bonded to one another, and where they would have a hydrogen, that's also bonded to one another. That causes a kink in the chain, and we can identify them because that kink in the chain keeps them from becoming solid at room temperature. Those straight saturated chains like butter, tallow, coconut oil, they lay on one another nicely, and they stack together like puzzle pieces, so they become solid at room temperature. These monounsaturated fats have a kink in them, and so they continue to float around one another at room temperature. Polyunsaturated fats, same story. They've got double bonds, more than one. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, all right? So before I move on, one thing that I really want to emphasize to you here, the difference when it comes to choosing what fats to eat and how to use these fats in your cooking. Remember, I make the recommendation with high heat, use saturated fats. With monounsaturated fat, use medium or low heat. And with polyunsaturated fats, use no heat. The reason why is because these double bonds here are susceptible to oxidization. Air, heat, and light bring a oxidative process and deform these fat molecules at that bond. When that happens and we take that food in, it sets off chain reactions inside of our body that elevates oxidative stress, which then elevates inflammation. And like we said at the beginning, that predisposes us to chronic disease. We don't want to be importing oxidative stress. We get enough of it from daily living. Okay, there's enough of it in our body. We don't want any more of it. All right. So let's go on to looking again at that structure determining function. This is what I find so fascinating about fats. First, we're going to talk about butyrate or butyric acid. That is a saturated fat, meaning it's just a string. It doesn't have any of those double bonds, and it's only 4 carbons long. And it's made the same as all the others. It's got the alpha end, it's got the omega end, but it's only 4 long. And when you have these 4 carbon long fats in your gut, it exerts potent anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, and pro-gut health effects. It feeds the cells that line our gut and keep them healthy. That helps out our immune system, that helps out our digestion. We need this butyrate. Our body can make it lots of ways, but one of the biggest ways that we can get it is from that fiber fermentation. When our gut bacteria break down those fiber molecules, they eat the sugar and in return give us butyrate and a few other things, but mainly butyrate, right? And that's great. We can also get butyrate from butter. Butter is the best direct dietary source for that kind of fatty acid. It's something that we want in our diet. Now, if you have no vegetables and you have no butter, your body has like redundancies in every way. We can make it from amino acids too, but it's easiest for our body to get it from fiber. And so there are more benefits from fiber than just butyrate. And so getting the fiber, help our body out, make that butyrate is great. Okay, so then here's another one just to show you another saturated fat. Lauric acid is a type of fat that makes up about half of the fat content in coconut oil. It is 12 carbons long. It's still just a big old straight molecule with oxygens on one side and a hydrogen capping it off at the other side, but it's 12 long, and it is a great fuel source for the brain. It doesn't have to go through any additional steps. When you eat it, it gets absorbed and goes straight to your brain, and your brain can use it to effectively fuel itself, which is pretty neat. It's one of the only fats that can do that. It also has been shown to aid in weight loss. It increases good cholesterol as well. So it's a wonderful thing to eat. On top of that, if you like to fry things, which I do, I like to stir fry vegetables a lot. When we cook with these saturated fats with this medium to high heat, it's much less likely to oxidize and turn into compounds that elevate our oxidative stress. So we want to use this fat whenever we're cooking with high heat. It has benefits in many different ways, both in the information signaling and in the structure of its resistance to that oxidative stress. So here's one of my favorite pieces of information, and this is why this ties back to that very first slide of why we aim to choose, let's say, animal fats that come from grass-fed animals, lightly processed, that lived as natural a life as possible. Okay, so we got 2 fats here. We have palmitic acid and stearic acid, palmitate and stearate. Palmitate is 16 carbons long, and stearate is only 2 carbons longer. It's 18 long. So palmitate is the primary fat that we have in our bodies. It's what our body makes with extra energy laying around to then store in our fat cells. So this ties into why obesity contributes to diabetes, why it is a pro-inflammatory condition. When our fat cells get too full and we're in the process of needing to stop the storage of fat in those individual fat cells, they start spewing out inflammatory chemicals that signal the body to stop putting stuff into those cells. And that is triggered by an excess of this palmitate in our body. So it's not inflammatory in small amounts, but in large amounts it is. and it contributes to inflammatory responses from our immune system, which then builds insulin resistance and contributes to diabetes, okay? Whenever we look at the fat of grain-fed animals, this is the fat that is primarily found in the greatest quantities in the flesh of grain-fed animals. So now let's look over at stearic acid. It's only 2 carbons longer than palmitic acid, but it beneficially reduces blood clotting and the risk of cardiovascular disease. It has no negative effects on insulin sensitivity, does not promote inflammation, and even triggers the death of breast cancer cells in petri dishes. More research is needed to see if it does that in actual people, but that's promising. The cool thing is, it is the primary fat found in the flesh of grass-fed beef, right? This is the reason, one of the many reasons, but this is the primary reason, physiologically speaking, that we're going to pay the extra money, go the extra mile to go and find grass-fed and finished beef. That's why it's important. When the beef spends a long time eating grains, it accumulates this fat that is inflammatory. When it's living on grass and it's taken to the meat market and it never ate anything but grass, the primary fat in its body is going to be the stearic acid, which is beneficial to our health. We have been told that saturated fat is flat bad, but that's because the majority of research on saturated fat has been done by testing palmitic acid's effects. There are many different kinds, and that's the main thing that I want to get across to you about saturated fats, is that there are plenty of them that are very good for us. And it is that structure that determines the information that's coming into our body, all right? So we got one more class of fats to really talk about, the polyunsaturated fats. So first of all, these are essential fats, just like those amino acids are essential. These other fats, kind of like palmitic acid, our body has the instructions to build it. If you've got enough carbons and oxygens laying around, it can make it. Our body does not have the instructions necessary to make these polyunsaturated fatty acids, and we need them for cell signaling within our body, so we must get them in through our diet. They're classified as omega-3s and omega-6s. Remember, the omega end of the fatty acid is that end that's away from the alpha end. The polyunsaturated part means that they have several double bonds, and the 3 and the 6 is how many carbons are between the omega end and the final double bond on that kind of kinked chain, all right? So omega-3s, this is a hot supplement right now. Omega-3s positively influence heart disease and diabetes, heart arrhythmias and cancer, high triglycerides, osteoporosis, and a laundry list of other things. Pretty much everything that goes wrong with our body in America right now seems to be helped by supplementation with omega-3s. And it's found in oily fish like tuna, salmon, sardines, mackerel, those kinds of fish. It's found in them and in certain kinds of seeds. But the particular type, because it's just like with everything else, it's more complicated than this, but the particular type that is found in the flesh of these fish is more bioavailable. Our bodies can use it, don't have to convert it into anything in order to use it, unlike the plant sources. The plant sources, we don't get quite as much of a beneficial effect, although we still do get beneficial effects. So get some flax seeds too if you want. Now, omega-6s, they're also essential. A lot of times they get demonized because they are typically in the standard American diet. They're in abundance far beyond what we need, but they are essential. They are crucial to the signaling of inflammation, which drives our processes of wound healing, regulating our blood coagulation, stimulating growth and repair of our muscles after we do some resistance training, and proper functioning of the immune system. So these are found in nuts and seeds, vegetables, and seed oils, okay? The thing to know is that both of these fats get converted by the same enzyme into molecules that either turn down inflammation or turn up inflammation. The 3s turn it down, the 6s turn it up. What we want is to consume these in a balanced amount so that we have the right amount of inflammation. Unbalanced to either direction causes health issues. The reason that 6s get demonized and 3s get venerated is because in our current society, in the ultra processed foods, anytime you go and get something that is fried, anytime you get something that has fat in it, that's in a package, we have these certain types of oils that have been made very available, very low cost, but they're primarily omega-6s. And whenever we eat those kinds of foods, our ratio gets way out of whack towards the inflammation side. So the gist of it, to balance your intake and balance out your inflammation as a result, is to eliminate all of those sources of refined omega-6s and take in your omega-6s from whole food sources. And typically we get enough of those omega-6s from about 2 palm-sized portions, between 1 and 2 palm-sized portions of any kinds of nuts whatsoever. Walnuts, pecans, you name it, they're great. Eat them all. Get a handful or 2 of those a day. Good things happen. And then in order to get enough omega-3s, we need at least 2 servings of that fish a week. You could probably go up to as many as 1 a day, right, to also get your protein, right? So to wrap up the fat discussion, for cooking, use saturated fats for high heat, use unsaturated fats for low or no heat. We're going to aim for wild-caught, naturally raised animals because they contain healthier fats than farmed and grain-fed animals. And that goes for fish too. Wild-caught salmon, not farmed salmon, right? Then lastly, with our omega-3 intake, we need to balance 3s to 6s for our optimal health. And that means eliminating processed foods, back to the very beginning, and making sure that we get 2 or more servings of fatty fish every single week. All right. So does anybody have any questions? That's about all I have to say for today, unless you have questions. Anybody?
On the omega-3, can you do a supplement that would be?
Yes, you can do a supplement, but that is a really good question because those polyunsaturated fatty acids that they're made out of, remember they've got a lot of those double bonds, which are susceptible to air, light, and heat. And when they have been oxidized, if they become oxidized in that extraction process from their source, then you're doing more harm than good with the supplementation. So yes, you can supplement with them, but vet your supplier. Look at their website, look at their messaging, and see if they are taking care to protect this oil from heat and from light and from air. How are they packaging it? How are they shipping it? Because these fats are very delicate and vulnerable to those things, and we don't want our supplementation doing more harm than good. So, if you buy the Great Value brand, I hesitate to get the lowest price brand because it's a lot cheaper to use extraction methods that expose things to air, light, and heat, right? So
just like a cold pressed.
Yeah, that's a good, like a cold pressed, a vacuum processing. Like you want to look at how they process, and if they take care to process it, they'll tell you because it's expensive, and that's how they compete, right?
So just be careful how you.
Yeah, be careful of your source, right? Go with a source that seems to be as high quality as possible, right? You had a question?
Yeah, all these protein drinks and protein bars and stuff like that. Are they really?
Not necessarily bad. They're not necessarily bad, but because they come with a barcode and they're in a package and they have an ingredient list, I consider them guilty until proven innocent. You got to look them over. You got to check and see if they have any of those ultra processed ingredients that we're talking about. If they come packed with thickeners and emulsifiers, artificial flavors and sweeteners, if they're coming with those artificial sweeteners and also preservatives, if they've got the high fructose corn syrup in them, look for those ingredients. There are some good ones on the market, but the majority of them are things that I would never consume because they are, even though they're kind of on the package, they say healthy, they say they're good for your immune system, they say anything that they want to say, but if it's ultra processed, we're going to avoid it. Anything else? Okay, well, you know where I work. If you do have any questions, you can come find me and ask me. And to wrap up, I just want to say Yako Key for coming out. Grateful that you decided to spend an hour listening to me talk about this stuff. And I want to encourage everybody to Impa Masali, means eat to heal. So thanks.